Just recently, I put out a video breaking down my first experiences with a new thing called Gyroflow. A lot of people had a bunch of questions about it early on, and I am now trying to answer all of those questions. It's a very complicated subject that I'm trying to distill into a very tight little video so that you guys will watch it, and it's complicated. So this video is going to serve as my best take at explaining how to use Gyroflow, what each of the settings do, and all of the best practices that you can use to make your videos smoother. Now, I should say before I set out that I am not an expert in Gyroflow. I've only been using it for a short while. Those guys are the devs, but I did have a chance to sit down with Adrian, who is one of the lead devs on the new Gyroflow project, and he was able to break down for me and help me understand all of the little minutiae of each of them. We actually sat on a 2-hour Discord call so that he could break down each of the little things. So I'm going to try to take all of this information that a very smart person gave to me, distill it into nuggets for you guys, explained by me, who is not really all that smart. So hopefully this all makes sense, and feel free to use the comments here as a place to ask more of those questions. I'll be watching them. Adrian and the Gyroflow team will be watching them, and we'll make sure that everybody gets this thing figured out. One last thing that I want to shout out is if you haven't done so, and especially if you're planning on using Gyroflow commercially, you should definitely go down into the links in the description below, and there's a link to the donation page. These guys have worked for free to make such an incredible piece of software that, especially if you're using this commercially, I highly recommend that you go and make a donation to their page. They have done so much work. You need to go out there and support it, because otherwise projects like this can't get funded and won't happen. So please go donate to Gyroflow. So what exactly is Gyroflow? And I want to make sure that we understand from a very high perspective what all is happening with this software. So that's going to help inform all of the little bits and pieces of the process of using it, because it's going to help us understand and help us move forward into that. So let's first break down the name, Gyroflow. Basically what that's saying is it's combining gyro information with optical flow data. We know what a gyro is. We know that there's different points of information about each axis that's happening, and it's just data that's been stripped from, whether it's one camera, a GoPro, a gyro black box, or something like that, and it's being laid out for you to be able to see that gyro information within Gyroflow. The flow side of Gyroflow is roughly optical flow information. What this means is that some algorithm is looking at your video and finding a bunch of contrast points. These contrast points are the things that the camera can specifically pull out and find these little pieces of detail that it can track from one frame to the next, to the next, to the next. And it's going to use those different points to do a bunch of complicated math to say, this is what the camera did in that movement. It looks at that point and it says, okay, that point moved from here to here, from here to here, from here to here, and I'm going to watch the camera information, and I'm going to watch what happens from frame to frame, and that is what I think the camera should have been doing. So the rough overview process of what it means to use Gyroflow is that you're trying to align that gyro data with that flow data, get them to match up perfectly, and then use the Gyroflow algorithms to stabilize that footage, because you know where the camera moved and where the camera should have moved. Once you've combined the gyro and the flow data, you can then take that information and put a smoothing algorithm on top of it. You can tell the camera, zoom in a little bit and then slowly move from A to B, because you can predict where that camera is about to go. So from a really, really rough overview, Gyroflow is the process by which we take gyro, optical flow data, merge them, and then run an algorithm on top of that to smooth out the motion of the frame within the overall video that you've captured. So before we really dive into the nitty-gritty of how Gyroflow works, I want to make sure that we start with the hardware side, meaning the actual physical camera that you're using and how you have that set up to make sure that you have the most success possible when you're taking all of that data and crunching it on the software. So let me show you a little bit about how I do Gyroflow so that you can start to kind of mirror my process to get the best results you can out of the kind of complicated software. So I wanted to bring you over to the bench to show you a couple of different options that you can use for black box logging. My favorite is using a GoPro, because these are very consistent, right? I know that if I hit record, it's going to start recording. When I stop record, it's going to stop recording. However, I've also considered using something like the Insta360 1R or the Insta360 Go 2. Also records gyro information. It's just a little bit less trustworthy, doesn't run as long as the GoPro, for example, and I can swap the battery on this. And Finally, you can also use the flight controller that's built into your drone for black box logging, and you can use that information to do the gyro stabilization. However, I just find this to be a little bit more fickle than something as simple as a GoPro at the cost that I need for the weight using a bigger camera like this Panasonic BGH1. Each of these different tools will produce the same result, and these three that have a gyro information built in already, you don't have to have an other logger for. You can use the video and the gyro information to stabilize it like you would, for example, in RealSteady inside of Gyroflow. Now, I have a good feeling that most of you watching this video are interested in how to use this Gyroflow with a cinema camera. So I'm going to go through the process for both using it for GoPro like you would with RealSteady, but also with a camera that doesn't have built-in gyro, combined with something like the GoPro to get that gyro information out of it. The easiest way that I've found to mount my gyro logging device, which is my GoPro, to my camera is just with a GoPro cold shoe mount. I just have a 1/4-20 screw literally drilled through the middle of this GoPro cold shoe that I can then take and wrench straight onto the camera, and it's going to hold it in place for forever. There's no way that this is ever going to come off. And then I can take the GoPro, Insta360, Insta360 Go 2, whatever I want, put it on that cold shoe, mount it in place, and now I can match the angle of the GoPro to the angle of the lens that's already on here. And that's going to allow me to get the gyro information out of this and reapply it later to this camera. With your camera on, with your gyro device perfectly mounted against the angle, or at least some easily reproducible angle in software, the next thing that you should really pay attention to is process. I really highly recommend speeding on the GoPro, waiting till it actually starts recording, and then hitting the recording on your other camera. If cinema cameras generally start to record as soon as you hit the button, where the GoPro has to come on, wait for a few seconds, and then it finally starts recording. And when you start recording, I highly recommend slating every single shot. Whether that's with a clapboard or with a whiteboard or a piece of paper or a notebook, or sometimes I just hold up a 1 when it starts recording and then give it a clap sync, or I use a slate or something like that. But that helps me make sure that I am picking the gyro logging file that I'm supposed to be using in post in combination with the actual shot that you're getting out of the camera, so that it's much easier to find the two files that match up to make sure that you're able to stabilize the footage coming out of the cinema camera. If you follow the steps of making sure that the gyro device and the cinema camera start recording at as close to the same time as possible, and that you slate them in, it's going to save you a ton of headache when you get into the post process with Gyroflow.
So the first step that I want to start with is camera calibration. Now, it's probably the thing that you're going to have to do the least in Gyroflow, but I figured I have a brand new lens here that I haven't actually set up for this camera for Gyroflow, so I figured we'd start with this. I'm going to leave it at the 12mm mark here on this micro 4/3 lens, which is not super wide, so I think it'll be an interesting thing to experiment with in the future. However, I do need to create a lens profile for it, so I thought I'd take you through my process of making that lens profile so that you can see at least once how it's done. So what I'm going to do over here is come onto the computer, you go down to lens profile and say create new. And it pops open this calibrator window that basically says you can enter your camera brand, model, lens model, camera setting, additional info. Please go through and fill this out, because you have the ability to upload this to the Gyroflow database. And if you fill all of that stuff out with good detail, then the Gyroflow team is going to be able to add it into the database for future people to be able to use. So I'm going to add my Olympus lens with the Panasonic BGH1 with the settings that I'm shooting on, so that it will upload and that they're going to be able to use it. What we can do is click this button to open calibration target. It's going to create this checkerboard by which we can then calibrate the lenses. Basically, we're looking at the distortion of the lens and being able to set what each of those settings look like against how that checkerboard is looking. So what we're going to do is go ahead and film, and I would suggest keeping your camera focused on the board at all times. I'm going to get close to where it's kind of filling most of the screen here, and this is where I'm going to do my first movement. Go ahead and get everything in frame, start speeding. I'm going to move it to the bottom right, bottom left, top right, keeping everything in frame and in focus. Take a step back. Double check my focus, bottom right, bottom left, top right, center it back up, take another step back, double check my focus, bottom right, bottom left, top left, top right. And that should be enough data to get this done. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut that camera, pull this card, and import it into the computer. Just keep in mind that you only ever have to do this step once for any given lens, so it doesn't actually take all that long. It just, this first time takes a few seconds. So once we've filmed this clip, we then take it, import it, and we can use the auto calibration to make sure that it's built a lens profile for that particular camera, resolution, frame rate, and everything. So this is what the output looks like that we get at the end of doing our calibration and auto calibration on the lens profile. You'll see that it's done 5 calibration points, and if you look at each of the calibration zones, you can see that it's done this calibration. It's detected all of those points, and it's good. So you can just double check each of these frames and make sure that it's actually highlighting the right parts of the frame that you have filmed for that calibration. And we can see that if we go and look at each of these, it looks like it's done a pretty good job of getting that thing tagged right, and it's chosen a frame that looks really good. The main thing that you need to look for to make sure that you have a good calibration is this reprojection error. You want your reprojection error to be somewhere between 0.1 and 1. That means that you have a really good reprojection error. It means it's a really, really solid calibration for the lens profile that you're using. If it's somewhere between 1 and 5, it's tolerable, but you should probably go back and try again to see if you can get it down to that 0.1 to 1 range. And then if it's above 5, basically don't use it. Just get rid of it. Start again. From there, you want to go and set the details about what that camera brand was. So in our case, it was a Panasonic, and it was a BGH1 camera. The lens model was the Lumix 12 to 35. Camera setting was C4K. And I'm going to add some additional info, meaning that the lens was 12 millimeter focal length, because I shot it at the lowest point of the zoom lens, so it's that I shot it at 12 millimeter. Calibrated by me, and it automatically put the resolution that we filmed it at. And then down here you can see this button that says upload lens to profile database. When you click that button, it's actually going to upload the profile that you've created to the servers for the devs to take a look at. And that's the important part about adding all of this information, is that if you have filled all of that out, the devs can look at that calibration profile and say, okay, this is good to send to the rest of the user base, and make sure that it's something that's valuable for them as well. So if you're interested in supporting the rest of the people that you should be, I highly recommend doing that. So if you go ahead and click upload lens profile to the database, just click export. You can say it automatically makes a name for it, so I'll just save that there. And then I want to submit the profile, and now it's done. Our lens is fully calibrated. The camera that we're using is fully calibrated, and we can go in here and open file, choose that thing, and it's automatically going to be applied to the footage that we shot with that camera. And that's going to allow us to then go forward with the stabilization process. Again, just to sum up, creating a lens profile is a little bit more complicated, like a little bit kind of frustrating of a step, but it's one that you only have to do once when you use a certain lens footage combo. So usually I shoot with my Panasonic BGH1 with a Laowa 7.5 millimeter. That profile is already created. When I shoot with my Wave, I have my Laowa 12 millimeter that I shoot with, and that profile is already saved. So I can just really quickly just queue that up, put it all into the thing, and go. So now that we've finished up with creating the lens profile, let's move on to the next parts of stabilization.
Okay, so we're going to drop back into Gyroflow, and now we're going to actually get to the stabilization process. And when I say the stabilization process, I mean like the setup for the stabilization process. And you basically have two sides of your window here. On the left side of the screen, you have the video information, the lens profile, and the motion data, and that's all your kind of inputs. And then the right side of your screen is your outputs. It's the auto synchronization, it's your stabilization settings, and it's your export settings. And basically you move from the top left of the screen on the left to the right side and work your way down. And that's kind of the general process. So at this point, what I want to do is start with the GoPro rendering process. So basically what you would be doing in place of, for example, real steady. And then we're going to go into the more advanced concepts with like using a black box logger and a thing, but something like that, because it's going to be easier to go from something that's a little bit simpler because it's all integrated data, and then one where it's separate, where there's two separate pieces of data coming in. So I've got a couple of different examples pulled, but I'm just going to use some footage from the United States Air Force Museum, which we shot at recently, and it's great footage. It's a great opportunity to use an example of something that I've just recently done. So you can see that this is just a GoPro file. I had to join two clips together, so that's why it's called joined. It automatically detected that it was a Hero 10 shot at 4K, that it's a 24 drop frame rate, and it automatically for us populated the GoPro wide shoot ratio dimensions, and that Adrian Eddy did the calibration of that footage for us. So he actually went through and set up every single GoPro footage that's already out there. And so really it's done the hard work. You can see that it automatically populated our motion data with the data from that same file. And then the very important thing to note here is that when you're using a GoPro, you're going to have this integration method set to none. Okay, and the reason that you do that, I'm not totally sure I understand this completely, but there's basically a fourth axis when you're computing gyro stabilization data, and you either have to basically use math to make that fourth axis that helps remember which position the camera is in the air, or the camera can already get that fourth axis for you for that camera. GoPro happens to get that fourth axis on board already, so we don't need to recalculate it. So what the integration method is basically the process of calculating that fourth axis. Now, I definitely can't give you the full explanation of what that axis is or what it's doing, but I just know that you need it to be able to synchronize the gyro data against video data. GoPro does it by default, so you don't need to do it again, but you can, because you can recalculate it later. So when you're loading GoPro files, just use the integration method of none. This button here toggles and untoggles the stabilization. You can see that it's already applying the stabilization settings. Now, I didn't really wipe down the lens or anything because I wasn't actually planning on using this footage for anything, so you can ignore how dirty it looks, but it's already doing it, and it's doing it in real time, which is pretty amazing. And you can even go through and look through all of the stabilization data and see all of the output of what's going on, and yeah, cool. So GoPro, getting everything lined up, super simple. Then it's just a matter of playing with all your synchronization and stabilization settings, which we'll come back to in a bit, because I don't think we need to kind of we'll go over that all in one go, because it's going to apply to both using a non-GoPro and a GoPro camera for stabilization. So now that we've looked at the GoPro side of things, let's look at the side of the cinema camera where things get a little bit more tricky. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to open my file from my Panasonic BGH1. So it's going to automatically load it into the Explorer, and it's by default not going to be stabilized, right? There is no lens profile applied, so it's just the raw footage straight out of the camera. And it gives us this message right here that says, you'll either say there is no lens profile or the lens profile aspect ratio doesn't match, and that's because it's still loaded up the GoPro file. So I'm going to go ahead and type, because I've already got this profile built, Panasonic, and it is this C4K Laowa 7.5mm 4K, and now the setting and the profile match the camera that this was filmed on, as well as the frame that it was filmed on. So we have now chosen our video information, we've chosen our lens profile. If we were using the 12mm lens that we calibrated earlier, we would just add that file here, and the last thing we need to do is add our motion data. So I've pulled into my example folder this GoPro clip, which I started pretty much at the same exact time as the Panasonic BGH1, so they should be pretty relatively laid out next to each other. So we've got our video information done, we've got our lens profile done, now we got to work on our motion data. You have a couple different options here. One is a low pass filter, and you have one that is rotation. Rotation, we'll come back to the low pass filter in a second. Rotation is the angle that the camera and the gyro logging device are different below 180 degrees. Okay, so if this AirPods case is my camera, and it's got like, a 20-degree angle, and my black box logging device, for example, is my flight controller, there's about a 45-degree difference in the angle that these two have. So you would use the pitch rotation to angle the data that you're getting out of the flight controller to be the same as the camera. Now, however, if you have, for example, the black box logging device flipped, or it's like facing backwards on your camera or something, there's a different method by which you're going to rotate that to get that information out of it. And we'll come back to that again also in a second with the IMU orientation, when we're going to try a different clip where it's not set up as XYZ. So for the purposes of this, we have our video information and our gyro data are very well aligned because we slated the thing. We started the cameras at the exact same time. And I used a GoPro here as my black box logging device, which is just pointing at the same exact angle as my Panasonic BGH1, so everything is perfectly aligned. Now, I've got a file here in a second where I have the Insta360 1R facing the wrong direction, and so I have to change the IMU orientation, and I'll show you kind of the difference between what it looks like when it's lined up right and when it's not. Now, because we don't have that fourth axis of information for the Panasonic, we have to now generate it, and so we have to choose an integration method that is not none. And you can see by default, Gyrolog has chosen the complementary integration method. You can use complementary, Madwick, or Mahoney. Each of those will generate that fourth axis for you. By default, just use what Gyroflow recommends to you. And if you have problems with stabilization later on, this is one of the things that you can go back and change to try different settings. But for now, I'm going to let it be default. So it's at this step in the process that I would start to look over at the synchronization side. I've got the data aligned. I've got the right file for each. I've got the lens profile built and set up. And so what I'm going to go over do is look at my auto sync settings. You've got three of the first three like standard things that you could or should change are rough gyro offset, sync search size, and max sync points. Usually I leave max sync points on 2, so I have one usually kind of at the start of the footage and one at the end of the footage, and I'll explain more of why I do that in the in a second. You have your rough gyro offset, so if you know, for example, you started your GoPro, waited 10 seconds, and then started your other camera, you need to align that offset as much as you can. So if there's a 10-second gap, either positive or negative, meaning like you maybe started one the other way, meaning maybe you started the Panasonic before the GoPro or vice versa, just give it that offset. So if you knew it was going to be like 4 or 5 seconds, you would just type in there's a 4-second offset between the footage that works and isn't. The sync search size means that it's going to take the optical flow sync information where it's giving you the XYZ for the optical flow as well as the XYZ for the gyro data, and it's going to try to align the points the best that it can within a search window of 5 seconds plus or minus. So I usually leave it about 5 seconds. You can run it up a little bit higher, a little bit lower if you're going slowly, but then all you should have to do from that point is click auto sync, assuming you have the right file, the right calibration and all this stuff, and it just usually takes a couple seconds. It's going to generate 2 points where it says this is good integration data, and you're going to make sure that it aligns to those things. So with our 2 sync points, what it's done is it's gone and created these 2 bars that are in here. That one is at the beginning of the footage and one is at the end, and you can use these to adjust where the optical flow data is relative to the gyro data. So if you look at this, you can see that if you look really close, there's a new white line that's appeared within the gyro data. The faded color that is more bouncy and stuff is the actual gyro trace from the GoPro, and the white line that's in there is the optical flow data. So if you look at the footage, you can see where your feature points are within the optical flow data, and that it's kind of, you know, that these are the points that it's tracking. And luckily for us, it's aligned fairly well with the gyro information that is available for that shot. And so it should actually probably look pretty close to stabilized here. So if we turn this off, you can see it's wandering around a little bit. You turn it back on, now it's pretty stabilized, and that's, you know, just using default settings. But the auto synchronization found those 2 points. It aligned that information because we did a good job, again, ahead of time, making sure that the footage was as aligned as possible with the gyro information, and it did a really good job. Now, if for whatever reason your footage, your optical flow data does not align with your gyro data, you can click on your sync point and you can actually maneuver where the data is relative to the gyro information. So if you need to, so like say it came out like this, you could see that, you know, this red point goes down, there's a little bit of a jump and it goes down over. I would just push this bar over until that data lines up, and it's going to look smoother or smooth like it should. Now you put an in and out point here across your data with the little closed brackets, or you can drag it and make it bigger and stuff. And as you let it play, it's going to play its way through those information. And as you adjust the gyro information, it's going to start to look a little bit weird because it's no longer matching the gyro with the optical flow. And as a result, the stabilization is going to start to fail. So all you have to do once you've got, you know, hopefully your auto sync is going to work and it's going to be close, but then you need to align your gyro data with the optical flow data. And then if there's any problems from there, you can still continue to make minute adjustments. If you put your cursor inside of the number of the milliseconds that it's changing here, you can just hold shift and move it forward or backward by, tenths of a millisecond. So I'm going to push it a little bit further, and I'd say that's probably a pretty good alignment. I'm looking at the background, seeing is there any wobbling or anything weird happening. Looks pretty good, so the rest of this footage should be stable. Now, the reason you only want really 2 of these yellow bars is because what this is doing is at that point in the footage, shifting and stretching the time of the optical flow data against the gyro data. So as the more you shift it on one of these yellow bars, it's also going to be relatively unshifted against the other yellow bar. And so, if you have like 5 or 6 of these and they're all shifted at different places, something's really wrong, right? Because it's basically all of this data should be linear against each other. So if you're saying you have 1 point at the beginning, you have it lined up there. You have 1 point at the end, you have it lined up there. It should be matching all the way through. It's not like your gyro record rate changes speeds throughout everything. It's you have it locked at the beginning, you have it locked at the end. So a lot of this looks really complicated, but again, if you take those steps at the beginning of your flight to just slate it, make sure your data matches, make sure you're recording with something reliable, and then get the camera started roughly at the same point, I have almost never had it fail on auto synchronization and stabilization. So I've given you a bunch of tips and tricks on how to make it work if it doesn't work. But the real kicker is just follow the process, get the process right when you're filming, and it's going to make it a lot easier when you get to post here. You have different integration methods over here. You could change to Magwick or Mahoney, and all it's going to do is affect how it does the math to make everything align. And so if one doesn't work, you might try the other. But in my experience, the default has worked almost every time. There's a ton more options here. Again, in synchronization, there are different places where it could or couldn't be useful, but again, by default, the default settings work really, really well. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that there, and we're going to kind of rewind and go back to when the IMU orientation does not match the information that you're seeing here on screen. So we've seen what happens in an ideal circumstance, but what happens if you, for example, have a new logging device, or you have some sort of error, or the camera was like upside down or something when you recorded? Who knows? Let's figure out how to fix that together. So I've got this file here from a later flight at the museum where instead of using the GoPro as my logging device, I used an Insta360-1R, and for one thing, it was mounted backwards, and another, by default, it's not the same XYZ IMU orientation as the GoPro, so we've got to kind of figure that out together. How do we do that? Well, let me load up my lens profile and open my data from the Insta360, and you can see looks pretty much the same as the GoPro, right? It's building these lens profiles. The data is a lot more dirty compared to the GoPro. There's a lot more like these like micro vibrations. Not sure why that is, but it doesn't seem to really affect it too much when I get it into post. So if this is one of those circumstances where putting a low pass filter on can be a little bit useful. The low pass filter here is just for your display purposes, right? It allows you to be able to see the data without it being all messy like that. So if I put it on for like 50 hertz, it cleans that trace up a lot, and it's a lot easier to look at. I could even go down to 20, go down to 10, I could do 0.2, and it's just making it a lot simpler to look at. I usually find like 50, it works for anything that I don't have any luck on. I'm going to go ahead and put this on X, Y, Z. My computer knows what the right answer is already because I've done it successfully. So for the purposes of the argument, this is what we're doing. And so I'm like, okay, everything's lined up. I think it's going to be good. Let's go ahead and auto sync. And we're going to wait for auto sync. And it's going to go through and it's going to find those couple good points that it wants to get that data from. And it's going to do its best to align it. But if the IMU orientation doesn't match up with the optical flow information, it doesn't have anything to search for, right? Because it looks for the peaks and the valleys of the IMU data and compares that to the peaks and the valleys of the optical flow data and tries to align them. But if your gyro data is traced to the wrong axis, or one of the axes is flipped, it's not going to know that. So we got to figure that out together. So I'm looking at these 2 different points that it added, and this one looks like it has some more interesting data to look at, something that's going to be a little bit easier to decipher. So I'm going to get in here, and I'm going to make this big, and I'm going to kind of scroll in and out. I'm using Alt to spread it out. And yeah, this doesn't look like it's in the right spot, right? The optical flow data is there, but it doesn't really make sense. But if we look, there's a pattern here where this red line drops steeply, and then there's also a nub in from the green line, and then the blue line remains pretty stationary. And if you look at this circumstance here, you got a relatively stationary line, you got a blue that goes over top and a red there. So I'm pretty sure that's going to be the right spot, so we've got to manually synchronize that. So I'm just going to click on there, and I'm going to drag this until, oh yeah, it does kind of line up with that. So that might actually be the right place. But if we look close, the green is where the blue most likely should be. And it looks like it's upside down, right? Because you have the blue kind of drop, and then it goes level. The green line goes up, and then it goes pretty level. Red looks like it's probably the right one, right? It's following that trace really well. And then blue is on the green gyro trace. So we know straight away that we need to switch the blue and the green lines. So one of these three X, Y, Z's, and it changes from camera to camera, unfortunately, needs to be flipped. So let's start with Z or Y, X, Z. Did that fix it? No, that actually made it worse. Okay, so let's go back to what it was, X, Y, Z. So then it's going to be the other set of two. So let's swap Z, Y. Now we're onto something. So now our blue matches our blue trace, our red matches our red trace, but our green is flipped. So all you have to do is make the one that is needing to be flipped the other case. So I don't know if it's green, red, or blue. I do actually, but I'm faking that I don't. So let's flip X. So I just go from capital X to lowercase x, and oh, that moved the red. So let's go back. Let's go to the Z. I'm gonna delete the Z and add a lowercase z, and oh, would you look at that? We've got a pretty well-matched gyro trace now compared to everything else. So, you know, and I'm going to, do a little bit of refining, make sure that this gyro trace is right on. Make this a little bit bigger so we can see it. Yeah, it's not perfect, but we stabilize it on that thing. So now that we have the proper IMU orientation, that's X, Z, Y, and we're going to want to just save that information for the next time that we use this data logging setup, let's go ahead and delete our synchronization points. Or this is how the way I do it. I don't know if this is the right way. I'm going to delete my synchronization points. We have our new proper IMU orientation. Let's just auto-sync it again. And what it should do is use those things, do the searching, and align it much better with where that data is. And would you look at that? So over here at our start, or our early point, green and blue are following, and the red is following itself well. And then back over here where it got messed up before, it's already set up. So now if we go through and play this, magically stabilize. Stabilization off, stabilization on. So that's what you need to do if your IMU orientation doesn't match up. It's a little bit confusing, and it's a little bit of kind of just poking and prodding and playing. But get yourself some synchronization points, get some optical flow data on there, and look to make sure if the IMU orientation is matching. Then recalibrate it if you need to. That's kind of been my foolproof way of testing out new devices. So now that we know how to align the gyro data with the optical flow data and get a relatively good synchronization, let's talk through the stabilization settings that we can change to make this look as juicy as we want it to. Okay, hey guys, I switched sides of the screen because we're going to use the settings that are way over there now instead of the settings that are on the other side of the screen. So we've got a good synchronization. We can see that there's some smoothing happening. What are the next settings that we can play with within the stabilization to get the look that we want out of our stabilized footage? So by default, you have the stabilization setting called default. And default is like 99% of the time what you're going to want to use. So it gives you just a really simple approach to doing smoothness, right? So you have your smoothness slider. You can crank it way up or way down, and it's going to change the amount of smoothness that your thing does. So at 0, obviously, it's bobbling around. It's not as good as it could be, but if you crank it up, it's going to be smoother. It's going to crop in a little bit more. There's going to be some different things that you're seeing as a result of changing that slider. And, for example, if you crank up your field of view, it's going to push it out, and you're going to actually see the whole footage around that frame and what's changing and how it's maneuvering it. Now, this is not a very aggressive flight, so it's not going to change it around too much. But you can see that the frame in the middle is what you're going to get when you are exporting. But then you can also see the rest of the video and how it's changing and how it's maneuvering in order to give you that footage. Like with those bigger turns that I'm making and stuff like that, you can see it's really cranking in, it's zooming in a lot to see it. Even if you look here in your bottom left side of your screen, if we set this to 1.0, you can see the amount of zoom that's happening in order to make this frame smooth and work. So you can actually, you know, if there's a really, really big maneuver, like coming up here, you see, oh, it's zoomed to 110%, 115, 112, and it goes back down as it zooms back out to make sure that you're not cranked in all the way all the time. That's a really useful feature to see. And if I put up more smoothness, you're going to see it, on average, crank that zoom ratio higher and higher, depending on the types of maneuvers that you're doing. So, you know, as far in as 110, 120. But yeah, so that's kind of the, you know, that's the short version of what smoothness is. If you go on smoothness, hit advanced, you have a per axis smoothness. And this is a really interesting thing where, for example, maybe I didn't want the yaw to be smooth at all to keep a little bit of field of view, but I wanted to do a little bit extra roll, and I definitely didn't want to see any pitch changes. You know, I can make those axes more smooth than others. So, for example, maybe I don't want any pitch smoothness, and any like change on the nose is going to be perfectly visible, but your roll, that axis is going to be even more smooth. So this is one of those examples of how you can get a little bit more tweaking out of each of these settings as you need. So really, default without per axis just matches everything, and if you change per axis, you can change up how everything looks to make sure that those other settings are smooth. So in general, I would recommend using default with non-per axis, just because it's really simple and really easy to use. But there have been circumstances where it was cropping in so much that I was like, okay, I gotta play with something else and try it. Other settings that you can play with within the advanced stabilization feature are, for example, dynamic zooming. You could, for example, turn off zooming altogether, and then it's going to keep it at the maximum frame. But as you make maneuvers, you're going to see the black bars push in from the side as it is adjusting the frame within everything. So I prefer to do dynamic zooming, and that's going to make sure that the visible box, this gray box that's on the inside, is always within those black bars, so you never see those black bars. And that's kind of how you get like stabilized footage. That's the same thing as what RealSet is doing to a degree. So again, if we set this back to a one field of view, you'll just see inside of that white box, and everything else is going to be moving around outside of it. You've got the option for rolling shutter correction, which I'm not going to really try to explain too much, other than if you have a camera that has really bad rolling shutter, you can use this to set the frame readout time and be able to reduce or get rid of rolling shutter. But basically, you know, if you move the camera too fast, it's going to warp the image within there because of the way that it reads the sensor. And you can put a correction in against that warp based on how the camera is set up. It's a little bit complicated, and if you need it, get in the comments and I'll send you a tutorial on how to actually do it. But for the most part, I don't think you're going to need it using GoPros and standard cinema cameras of today. So what are the other stabilization models? So you've got Plane 3D, which is actually probably the simplest of all of these in how it operates. But it's not, you really only want to use this when you're doing like handheld, when there's very, very little moving. Like, so if you're just pushing straight forward or only moving straight forward, it's a really good option to use. But you can see that it zooms so much on this setting. You can see it just here. Let's put our field view back out. You can see just how much that's actually punching in. But if we go back to default, sorry, hold on. So let's go to Plane 3D. You can see it's pretty stinking zoomed in there. And this is, let's put both of these at half smoothness. Whoa, super zoomed. But if we go back to default, it's back out to the normal. So, just something to think about. So if you're doing really, really straight and level flying, Plane 3D actually will probably do a better job than default, but, it is what it is. There's another one that's called velocity damped, where you still have the same smoothness slider, but when you're doing really, really quick maneuvers, you can either have it like really quickly follow that maneuver or slow down along the way. And so you play with the velocity at the smoothness at high velocity and the velocity factor to make sure that it's getting the right feeling that you want. So if you want it to kind of like go woof, 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 you do a high velocity. But if it makes a big maneuver and you want it to kind of like catch up, you can do a higher velocity factor. So it's just a matter of figuring out how do you want it to behave when you want it to behave. And then finally, fixed camera would be if you want the camera to only point in one direction ever. Like you're trying to stabilize a tripod or something like that, you use it. But for the purposes of flying drones, you're never going to want to use that. So again, most of the time, just recommend using default and then playing with the smoothness and the zooming speed. The lower the zooming speed, the more it's going to breathe. So if we go back to 1 here, you're going to see as I make maneuvers, it goes, it's really cranking the zoom in and out as fast as it can. And I don't think that's a very desirable look, personally. just to see it going like this. I've found that a zooming speed of like 2.5 feels pretty good. Like it breathes, but it definitely doesn't. And that's just the period of time over which it will do the zoom. And so I've found that 2.6, 2.5, something like that looks pretty good without it being too much of like the breathing maneuver. But yeah, so default, smooth this in the 75% range, zooming speed in the 2.6 range is one of the better like looks that I've been getting out of all of this. So yeah, so that's everything for stabilization. There's a lot more that you can play with, but know that, you know, use default for the most part, and then there are other options if you need to get a different look out of the way that is, and the only way to really kind of figure all those things out is just to have a play. Like I've used, like for a certain like higher speed, like chase footage, stuff like that, I want it to be a little bit tighter, a little bit more quick to react, but when I'm doing something smooth and flowy like this, here at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, I want it to be a little bit slower and take its time and just kind of be that smooth, silky, all that kind of stuff. So now that we've kind of gone through all of the stabilization settings that you can use, I'm going to really quickly cover export settings. Under export settings, you have a bunch of different options on how you want to export it. H.264 would be like older GoPros or non-data intensive modern GoPros. H.265 is a lot like GoPro. It's just different versions of hardware encoding. It can work in a few less applications, like sometimes Windows doesn't like H.265. I usually use H.265 or ProRes. ProRes is takes the 10-bit color that I've put in here, so I used 422 10-bit color ProRes video input, so I wanted to also output that, so I use ProRes and then I bump it up to at least HQ, sometimes 444, just to get that color depth that I spent all this time shooting with this big camera. You've got your aspect ratio, you know, which is by default the same as the input aspect ratio. Bitrate is the same as your input bitrate, and then you can decide whether or not to export audio. And then across the bottom here is where you're saving it to, so you can either, you know, choose the little dots and pick a different spot or save it to wherever it is, and then you can rename it on the way out. Super easy. When you click export, it exports. When you're inputting 10-bit, you can't use GPU encoding, and there will often be errors with GPU encoding. It's kind of a more experimental or a newer feature, but just pay attention to the error, make sure your graphics drivers are up to date, and report anything after you have read all the bubbles and have had issues with it. So yeah, that's exporting. I mean, exporting is pretty simple. You just use the output mode that you want, and everything else that you have set is going to follow that, and it's going to export that for you into a brand new file. Well, I know that we've basically been drinking from a fire hose here when it comes to Gyroflow tutorial and overview. I've tried to equip you with all of the different tools and the different processes and the way that I have been doing it and succeeding with it. I know that it's probably not going to answer every single question that's out there, but that's definitely what the comments are for below. That's what the Discord for Gyroflow is all about, and it's, you know, there's just a lot of different stuff that can go into that, so I appreciate you bearing with me, walking through my stabilization process, and just, you know, learning the way that I've had success doing it. I think if I was going to leave you with one thing, it's just focus in on the process, right? Make sure that you have everything set up the same way every single time you do it, that you start the cameras at almost exactly the same time, that you use a confident black box or a logging device like a GoPro, and it makes it pretty easy. It makes it pretty hard to have a problem with it when you get to this point. So, you know, there's a lot that was gone into this. I know that I was drinking from a fire hose, but I appreciate you guys listening. Please consider liking and subscribing to this channel. I make content like this for you guys so that you can enjoy the results of Gyroflow and stuff like that. Send a big thank you to the devs. Again, their donation link is going to be in the description below, and you got to hit them up, got to get them the support that you can, because they have done something absolutely incredible here. Please don't hesitate to share this video and tell your friends about all of it. I've got a ton of affiliate links in the description below that helps support this channel and allow me to be able to make more videos like this, so please consider checking all of that stuff out. Thank you so much for watching this video, and stay flying.